She convinced the world she could change medicine with a single drop of blood. But the dark truth is that, in the end, the person most deceived by the $9 billion fraud may have been Elizabeth Holmes herself. Imagine a figure, almost a silhouette, standing on a stage. She's dressed in a uniform that's become as iconic as a superhero's costume, a simple black turtleneck. Her blonde hair is pulled back, often a little messy, as if she's too busy changing the world to worry about perfect styling. Her eyes are wide, intense, and they rarely blink. And when she speaks, the voice that comes out is a surprisingly deep, deliberate baritone. It's a voice that commands attention, a voice that doesn't ask for your trust, but assumes it. This was Elizabeth Holmes, and for a time, she was the new prophet of Silicon Valley. She wasn't just the CEO of a company, she was a visionary, hailed as the next Steve Jobs. And the gospel she preached was a promise so revolutionary it felt like science fiction. A world where a single drop of blood could unlock the secrets of your health. To understand the meteoric rise and the $9 billion valuation of her company, Theranos, you have to understand the power of the story she told. It began not in a sterile laboratory, but with a simple, universal human fear, the fear of needles. Holmes often recounted her own childhood terror of them, a story that made her mission deeply personal and relatable. Who hasn't flinched at the sight of a needle? Who hasn't dreaded the uncomfortable process of a traditional blood draw? The tourniquet, the search for a vein, the vials of blood? Holmes tapped into this shared experience and presented a beautiful, elegant alternative. She painted a picture of a world where diagnostics weren't a painful ordeal to be endured once a year, but a constant, seamless part of life. She envisioned a future where healthcare wasn't reactive and painful, but proactive, accessible, and painless. Her own origin story was perfectly crafted for the Silicon Valley mythos. She was the brilliant, driven chemical engineering student at Stanford, one of the most prestigious universities in the world. But like the tech titans before her, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg, she didn't have time to finish her degree. The vision was too urgent. At just 19 years old in 2003, she dropped out, using her tuition money to found the company that would become Theranos. The name itself was a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis, a perfect encapsulation of its ambitious goal. The narrative was irresistible. A young genius sacrificing a conventional path to pursue a world-changing idea. She wasn't just building a company, she was answering a calling. This wasn't about profit, it was about purpose. She spoke of a world where people could detect diseases like cancer or diabetes at the earliest possible stage, right from a small device in their local pharmacy or even their own homes. She used powerful, emotional language, talking about a future where no one would have to say goodbye too soon. The centerpiece of this vision was a small, sleek black box she called the Edison. This device was the miracle machine. It promised to run hundreds of complex laboratory tests, from cholesterol checks to intricate genetic analyses, all from a single tiny drop of blood, pricked from a fingertip. The implications were staggering. It would democratize healthcare, taking power away from giant labs and insurance companies and putting it directly into the hands of the individual. It was a promise of empowerment, of knowledge, of control over one's own body. In an era of ever-rising healthcare costs and complexity, this simple, powerful idea felt like a ray of light. But an idea, no matter how brilliant, is worthless without believers. And this is where the dark psychology of Elizabeth Holmes truly began to shine. She wasn't just a scientist or an entrepreneur. She was a master storyteller and a magnetic personality. She consciously and meticulously cultivated an image. The black turtleneck was no accident. It was a direct and deliberate homage to Steve Jobs, a visual cue that told the world to place her in the same category of revolutionary genius. It projected an aura of focus, simplicity, and unwavering dedication. Her lifestyle reinforced this image. She claimed to work relentlessly, sleeping only a few hours a night, adhering to a strict vegan diet of green juices, and foregoing vacations and personal relationships. She was a martyr for her mission, and people were drawn to that kind of ascetic devotion. Then there was the voice. Those who knew her in her youth said she spoke in a much higher register. The deep, commanding baritone was, by many accounts, an affectation, a performance. In the male-dominated worlds of tech and finance, a young woman's higher-pitched voice might be dismissed, but her low, measured tone was impossible to ignore. It conveyed authority, seriousness, and an almost hypnotic calm. When Elizabeth Holmes looked at you with her unblinking eyes and spoke in that deep voice, she made the impossible sound inevitable. With this powerful persona, she set out to conquer the world. And she didn't start with small-time venture capitalists. She aimed for the heavens. She assembled a board of directors that was so star-studded it seemed absurd for a startup. It included 2 former U.S. Secretaries of State, George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, a former Secretary of Defense, William Perry, and David Boies, one of the most famous lawyers in America. These were not tech experts or medical scientists. They were titans of industry and politics, powerful, older men who were utterly captivated by her charisma and her grand vision. They saw in her the embodiment of American innovation. She knew her audience. She didn't sell them on the complex biochemistry. She sold them on the story, the dream of a better world, and the chance to be a part of the next great technological revolution. The fear of missing out, or FOMO, is one of the most powerful forces in investment, and Holmes wielded it like a weapon. She created an aura of intense exclusivity. Getting a meeting with her was a privilege. Investing in Theranos was like being invited into an inner sanctum. No one wanted to be the person who passed up on the next Google or Apple. So the money poured in. Powerful families like the Waltons, founders of Walmart, and media mogul Rupert Murdoch invested hundreds of millions of dollars. They weren't given full access to the technology. They were sold on the vision, on the all-star board, and on the magnetic force of Holmes herself. The secrecy was framed not as a red flag, but as a necessary precaution to protect their revolutionary technology from competitors. It was a fortress of mystique. With capital and connections secured, Theranos moved from a theoretical concept to a seemingly tangible reality. The company forged major partnerships with giants of the retail and pharmacy world. Walgreens invested millions and began building Theranos wellness centers in its stores in Arizona. Safeway, the supermarket chain, spent over $350 million building special clinics in its stores, all in anticipation of the Edison machines that were just around the corner. These deals were massive public validations. If trusted, multi-billion-dollar companies like Walgreens and Safeway were on board, then the technology must be real. The promise was about to be fulfilled. The media fell in love with her. She graced the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Inc. magazines. She was lauded as the youngest self-made female billionaire in history. She was placed on panels with Bill Clinton and Jack Ma. She was the new face of female empowerment in tech, a role model for a generation. By 2014, Theranos was valued at a staggering $9 billion. Holmes, who owned half the company, was worth an estimated $4.5 billion on paper. She had reached the pinnacle. She had the turtleneck, the deep voice, the powerful board, the massive partnerships, and a valuation that rivaled established industry giants. She had sold the world a beautiful, compelling dream of the future. The problem, hidden deep within the secretive labs of Palo Alto, was that the dream was just that, a story. The miracle machine, the Edison, didn't work. And the entire $9 billion empire was built not on a single drop of blood, but on a vast and terrifying ocean of lies. Behind the sleek facade of Theranos' Palo Alto headquarters, a very different story was unfolding. While Elizabeth Holmes was on magazine covers, charming world leaders, and raising hundreds of millions of dollars, her own scientists and engineers were living in a state of quiet panic. They knew the truth. They knew the Edison machine was a fantasy. It was prone to constant errors, its results were wildly unreliable, and it could perform only a tiny fraction of the tests Holmes claimed it could. The revolutionary technology that was supposed to change the world could barely get a single simple blood test right. The company wasn't a well-oiled machine of innovation, it was a pressure cooker of fear, intimidation, and deception. Employees were siloed, forbidden from communicating with other departments to prevent them from connecting the dots and realizing the full scale of the fraud. Those who raised concerns, who questioned the science, were either marginalized, threatened with lawsuits by the infamous lawyer David Boies, or fired. The atmosphere was one of a paranoid regime, not a visionary startup. The great secret of Theranos was that to get results for their Walgreens wellness centers, they weren't using their magical Edison boxes. They were secretly using standard, off-the-shelf blood testing machines made by companies like Siemens, the very same technology they claimed to be disrupting. Worse, to make the tiny finger prick samples work in these big machines, they had to dilute the blood, a practice that severely compromised the accuracy of the results. This wasn't just a corporate lie, it was a medical one. Real people were making health decisions based on dangerously flawed data. The first crack in this fortress of secrecy came not from a government regulator or a suspicious investor, but from a persistent journalist. In 2015, John Carreyrou, an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, received a tip. A former lab director, skeptical of the company's claims, had spoken out. Carreyrou, a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, began to dig. He was met with a wall of silence and legal threats. Theranos unleashed its powerful legal team trying to intimidate Carreyrou and his sources, who were mostly brave, terrified former employees who had risked their careers and finances to expose the truth. But Carreyrou was relentless. On October 15, 2015, he published his first bombshell article. It laid bare the core deception. The Edison didn't work, and the company was cheating on its own tests. The $9 billion Empress had no clothes. The world was stunned, but Holmes's reaction was not one of contrition or quiet retreat. It was one of defiant, aggressive denial. The very next day, she went on CNBC's Mad Money with Jim Cramer. Dressed in her signature black turtleneck, looking straight into the camera with those unblinking eyes, she delivered the performance of a lifetime. She was calm, collected, and utterly dismissive. "This is what happens when you work to change things," she said in her deep baritone. "First, they think you're crazy. Then they fight you. And then, all of a sudden, you change the world." She framed the exposé not as a revelation of truth, but as an attack by vested interests, a jealous old guard trying to stop the future. She didn't just deny the allegations, she inverted them, casting herself as the victim, the persecuted genius. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She was betting that her story was more powerful than Cariou's facts. For a moment, it almost worked. Her powerful board members stood by her. But the dam had broken. Cariou kept publishing. More whistleblowers came forward. And the carefully constructed reality of Theranos began to dissolve. This brings us to the central, most haunting question of the entire saga. Did she really believe her own lie? Was Elizabeth Holmes a cold, calculating con artist? A cynical manipulator who knew from the start that her technology was a fraud? Or was she a true believer who became so lost in her own myth that she could no longer distinguish her grand vision from the grim reality? The truth, as is often the case, is likely a complex and terrifying shade of gray that lies somewhere in between. To understand it, we must look at the psychology of extreme self-deception. One key concept is cognitive dissonance. This is the profound mental discomfort we feel when our beliefs clash with reality. When a smoker reads a report that smoking causes cancer, they experience dissonance. To resolve it, they can either quit smoking, change the behavior, or rationalize it away by saying, "My grandfather smoked his whole life and lived to be 90. Change the belief. Elizabeth Holmes was living in a state of extreme cognitive dissonance. Her core belief was, "I am a visionary genius changing the world." The reality was, "My technology is a failure and I am deceiving everyone." Quitting was not an option. Her entire identity, her fame, her fortune, the $9 billion valuation, it was all tied to the vision. So the only way to resolve the dissonance was to warp reality to fit her belief. The lie grew incrementally. At first, it might have been a small exaggeration, a classic case of Silicon Valley's fake-it-till-you-make-it ethos. But as the stakes got higher, as the lie got bigger, the cost of admitting the truth became catastrophic. So she doubled down, and then tripled down. With every new investment, every glowing magazine cover, the lie became more entrenched. She surrounded herself with loyalists and yes-men, people who reflected her own grand narrative back at her, while systematically eliminating anyone who dared to present the contradictory reality. Her mind may have performed a desperate psychological trick, convincing herself that the vision was the reality. The fact that the technology didn't work right now was just a temporary setback, a minor engineering problem on the inevitable path to success. In her mind, the future she promised was so certain that lying about the present was justified. She wasn't lying, she was simply articulating a future truth. This kind of thinking is often associated with narcissistic personality traits. The grandiosity, the unwavering belief in one's specialness, the sense of entitlement, and, crucially, a profound lack of empathy. Holmes spoke passionately about saving lives, but her actions showed a chilling disregard for the actual patients whose health was being jeopardized by her faulty tests. One woman was wrongly told she was miscarrying. Others received results suggesting they might have cancer or other serious conditions. Their real-life terror was just collateral damage in service of her grand vision. Her mission was so important in her mind that the rules didn't apply to her. The truth was whatever she needed it to be. This is the reality distortion field famously attributed to Steve Jobs, but Holmes's version had a more sinister edge. Jobs used his charisma to push engineers to achieve the impossible. Holmes used hers to convince people the impossible had already been achieved. She compartmentalized. In one part of her mind, she was the noble visionary. In the other, she was overseeing a massive fraud, and she built a wall between the two so they would never have to meet. The fall, when it finally came, was as swift and dramatic as the rise. With Carrer's reporting opening the floodgates, regulators who had been charmed and stonewalled by Holmes finally acted. The FDA and CMS launched their own investigations, uncovering damning evidence of lab failures and unsafe practices. In 2016, Walgreens terminated its partnership and sued Theranos. The company was forced to void 2 years' worth of blood test results. The $9 billion valuation evaporated, becoming utterly worthless. The powerful board members quietly resigned. In 2018, the SEC charged Holmes and her former partner, Sunny Balwani, with massive fraud. The company that had promised to revolutionize healthcare shut its doors for good. The final act played out in a federal courtroom. The iconic black turtleneck was gone, replaced by the conservative attire of a criminal defendant. The deep baritone was less prominent. The spell was broken. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the testimony of those she had deceived and intimidated, the myth of Elizabeth Holmes was dismantled piece by piece. In January 2022, she was found guilty on 4 counts of defrauding investors. She wasn't convicted of defrauding patients, a subtle legal distinction, but a moral failure that will forever define her legacy. The visionary was a felon. Her story serves as a terrifying modern fable, a warning about the seductive power of a good story, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the dark, tangled psychology of a lie so big the liar herself may have become its final, most devoted believer. Now I want to know your opinion. Was she a genius con artist or the first one to believe her own lie? Comment below with what you think.